weeks ago, the sun would rise, that's all I needed to know. Yesterday's clothes and I was good to go. My wooden sword against the world, and every day was like a holiday. Dusty gully where we used to play, taking apples from the branch along the way.
I grew up in Staten Island, and I went to St. Peter's High School, where my father went. Staten Island at the time, this is the early 60s, was pretty constricting, I think. Had 250,000 people and no bookstore. And I was interested in getting out as soon as I could. My brother did exactly the same 3 years after me. Got out of St. Peter's High School and went to college far away. So I liked the idea of being in the city, being in Manhattan. And when I went to Rutgers, I was an hour away on the bus, so I took the bus into the city all the time. But the idea of being in the city and having all these great restaurants available, having the opera, having the ballet, which I discovered at Manhattan College, having theater, was just terrific. It was. I graduated college in June 1965, and in September 1965, I enrolled at Rutgers. I started teaching right away. I had 2 sections of freshman composition. One began at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the other began like at 11 o'clock in the morning. No preparation. I can't imagine a program today not training its people beforehand, not having what they called comp camp when I ran the program at Brandeis. But that's what they did at Rutgers. I remember asking the fellow who ran the program, saying, hey, what am I supposed to do? And he said, look, we could tell you lots of stuff, but you'd forget it anyway the first day of class. And so, all right, I began the program. It was an all-literature program. We read Conrad's The Shadow Line. We read Nabokov's Speak Memory. We read The Tempest, and we read Robert Frost's poems. There were hour exams, and there was a common final exam set by the director of the program. So the control of the program was firmly in the hands of the senior faculty member, and the teaching assistants all met with each other to talk about grading, to talk about classroom procedures, but we never came up with assignments of our own. So we were pretty strictly controlled. Each of us would take home the exams from somebody else's section and grade them in pencil. Then they would be given back to the person who ran the section, and he would grade them and give the final grade. So it was called cross-grading. The assignments were the thing that made the course, it seems to me. The senior faculty members who ran the program had all gone to Amherst College and had all gotten PhDs at Harvard. And they based their assignments on the program that they had when they were freshmen at Amherst College, or what they did when they taught at Harvard under Reuben Brower, who ran the Hum-6 program at Harvard and had come from Amherst College. So this was definitely an Amherst program at 1 remove or 2 removes, depending upon how you count Harvard. They were very puzzling assignments. Robin Varnum has written a book about the Amherst program, and it's she captures the difficulty of some of those assignments quite well. The map is not the territory, and if you're looking at a road map, what are you looking at? Are you looking at just lines on a piece of paper? How are you supposed to visualize those and translate that into real terrain? Our assignments were not that complex and that puzzling, but they were nonetheless very, very carefully designed with lots and lots of steps. So there would be a quotation, for instance. I remember one of the poems on an hour exam was Gerard Manley Hopkins' In the Valley of the Elway. Poem I had never seen before in my life until it showed up on the hour exam. And it asked like 6 questions about the poem and then invited the students to write an essay based on the answers to those 6 questions. It's a technique that you don't see much these days except in Bartholomew and Petrosky's book, Ways of Reading, which is, Bartholomew went to Rutgers and learned a lot from the program there too. I like the complexity of those assignments. It took the students through them step by step, and it very much influenced me. When I write assignments now for the Norton Reader, which I just finished doing last week, I frequently keep those assignments that we did at Rutgers in mind. So the atmosphere at Rutgers was heavily biased toward writing about literature, and indeed it turned out to be heavily biased toward writing. And so my colleagues who were English department TAs at Rutgers, many of them wound up teaching writing. Don McQuaid, one person, Bob Atwan, who was there as well, taught writing for many years and now edits the Houghton Mifflin series on Best American Essays. He's done a lot of writing textbooks. Linda Flower, who teaches at Carnegie Mellon University, is a very, very well-known writing scholar. Dave Bartholomew is an extremely well-known writing scholar at the University of Pittsburgh. There are others. There was a guy named John Langan, whom I never knew at Rutgers, but who got his MA at Rutgers, never finished a PhD, and he wrote best-selling books, one of them called English Skills, published by McGraw-Hill back in the 70s, and that did extremely well. These are all people who are influenced by the Amherst program as seen through Harvard's implementation of it, and then through Rutgers' implementation of that. So it's it was a very, very powerful influence. Pat Bizzell, who teaches at Holy Cross, Bruce Hertzberg, who teaches at Bentley College, they were also people at Rutgers who were influenced by that program. So when I was working on my dissertation, I started looking for a job, and I found one at Queensboro Community College at the City University of New York. I didn't know anything about Queensboro. I went out there for an interview, and I liked the people who interviewed me. Lynn Troika and Jerry Noodleman interviewed me. It turns out that they were hiring 13 new tenure-track assistant professors in something called the Department of Basic Educational Skills, which was set up to be the remedial writing department of Queensboro, not the English department. Okay, I got there. I was making $14,000 a year, by the way, full-time. The teaching load was 4 courses in the fall and 2 courses in the spring, essentially like a 3 and 3. You'd meet the students 2 days a week in class, and then have 3 hours for each class set aside for conferences. We were overwhelmed by students at Queensboro. They set up a whole bunch of what we call portables, which were small classroom modules on the side of a hill, and maybe there were 20 of them. And we each taught in one of those. The 13 of us as assistant professors, or instructors and assistant professors, I guess you had to get a PhD to become an assistant professor, worked with Lynn Troika and Jerry Noodleman, who were the pre-existing faculty members in the department. Our department was divided into the reading side and the writing side. They hired about 9 people in the reading side too, because they had set up a reading course, a remedial reading course, as well as a remedial writing course. The 13 who were hired were almost all local folks from New York, grew up in New York, had degrees from colleges around New York City. I think that pretty much was a result of the fact that they were hiring at the last minute. They were hiring in the summer of 1970 to begin in September 1970. They did not go to MLA or anything like that, or any national conference. So they just interviewed local folks and hired local folks. we were encouraged to use the book that Troika and Noodleman had written, a book called Steps in Composition, which was pretty much a standard freshman composition book, but it was sort of diluted for basic writing students. We didn't use the word basic writing at the time. We used the word remedial. It was not required, but it was strongly recommended. And I tried it for a couple of semesters and found it very useful. It was not earth-shattering pedagogy by any means. It essentially had students writing 5-paragraph essays and working on their punctuation and grammar. They really needed a jolt of standard written English because their high schools had not provided them with great success in overcoming the issues of writing standard written English. Many of the students were English as a second language students, and we quickly set up special sections of ESL. It was always difficult getting the right students into the right sections because many students who were English as a second language students were perfectly fluent in English. Others had arrived much more recently. We had a good number of Haitians, for instance, who came, and Chinese students who came, and those had arrived much more recently, and their English really needed intensive work to get them up to the standard. What was happening at CUNY was that we knew these students would be kicked out if they didn't succeed in our courses. In Errors and Expectations, Shaughnessy has a sentence about sitting down in this worn urban classroom and reading the papers of these students, first-year students at City College, and realizing that these students were at the 11th hour of their academic lives. That is, if they didn't get better really quickly, they would be out. They wouldn't be out because there was a CUNY-wide test that was used to sort them, but they would be out because they would fail the first-year writing course, and probably the first-year math course, and probably the first-year reading course, and then not maintain a good enough grade point average, and so they would be dropped. And that was very evident to us at Queensboro, that these students were there to succeed, and if they didn't succeed, they wouldn't be there anymore. Now, there's a long history of that in the 20th century in American colleges. Freshman English was always used as the course to sort students out, and if they couldn't handle freshman English, they left. I can show people that at the University of Illinois in 1913, and colleges at Indiana University in the 40s. Freshman comp has always been the gateway course, and the revolving door is usually based on first-year writing courses. My course was clearly a part of that, a gateway course, because we were not in the English department. We were in the basic skills department, and if we passed our students and then they couldn't do the writing that they were supposed to in the English department, we would be in trouble as a department or as faculty members. So we were tough graders, and many of our students did not succeed in our courses. They could take them again, of course, but the dropout rate was rather high, and I'm sure people noticed that at the central headquarters at 80th Street, and they were quite appalled at the number of students who started the college and did not succeed. And part of the reason they didn't succeed was because they couldn't write well. So our job, as we saw it, was to get those students to write well as quickly as possible. Not write in a very sophisticated way, but we wanted them to produce a lot of writing and to produce a lot of edited American English. So the students in my course were sharp enough to realize that every time they put the pen to the paper or left the pen off, they could make a mistake in edited American English, in punctuation, in spelling, in grammar. Therefore, many of them didn't write a whole lot. But my job was to get them to write more, to give more details, to become more fluent. So I had to bridge the gap between their reluctance to say something that could get them in trouble and their the need that I had and any reader would have for rich details about their experience or rich arguments for the students to make about their point of view. So there was an inherent conflict between the grammatical side and the fluency side. And I'm not sure we ever managed to bridge that. Students were no fools. They knew what we were looking for, but many of them decided at least not to say much. And part of our job was to get them to say a lot more. So it turned out that Queensboro Community College was a sort of nest of publishers because the research we were doing was curriculum research. We wanted our students to succeed, and we were trying anything we could think of to help them become better writers. We weren't satisfied that the old ways were getting them to become successes. So I guess we were trying anything in the classroom, and then talking to publishers about it. Publishers were all in New York in those days, or almost all of them. I think Scott Forsman was in Chicago and Hoot Mifflin was in Boston, but the rest were all in New York. And they were very interested in this grand experiment that CUNY was involved itself in. We were thought to be experts at this stuff, and at the same time, we did not think we were experts at all. We were trying to experiment. We were trying to figure this stuff out. So we were seen as real experts, but we didn't feel that when we were actually doing it. So McQuaid was doing the same kind of thing at Queens College. People all over the City University were doing things. Bill Herman was doing things. People were doing things at the City College of New York. Ken Bruffy was doing things in Brooklyn College. There were experiments and textbooks published all over the City University. In fact, I think there were probably more textbooks written at CUNY in the 70s than almost any place else, any other single institution in the country. So the assignments we gave our students, mostly drawn from steps in composition, but there was plenty of development of assignments, new approaches to assignments, and what now would pass for research going on in my department. And that was a direct result of Lynn Troiker and Jerry Noodleman urging us to do that. So two of my colleagues, Minette Reinitz and Judy Kaplan, had a template for writing that they gave to their students. And it was, most people think, ... but I think. This is 30 years before they say, I say, but essentially it had some of the same stuff in it. It had the common wisdom, and then it had the individual take on that. It wasn't nearly as developed as Graff and Birkenstein's book, but it was in that line of thinking. I look back later at that, and I see that was a genuinely rhetorical assignment, asking students to talk about the common wisdom, and then talking about their individual take on the situation. And it was extremely flexible because it could be used in almost any situation. Most people think this about abortion, most people think this about pollution, most people think this about X, and then the student's own voice coming through with, but I think, and here's why. And the student then, of course, had to give reasons. So it essentially led students into both a description of their own thinking and a sort of semi-argumentative piece with good reasons for it. Anyway, Lynn's dissertation topic was based on role-playing and games in freshman composition courses, and it later resulted in a book Prentice Hall published called Taking Action. And essentially, she divided up the basic skills faculty into two groups, one of which was the experiment group, one of which was the control group. I was in the experiment group. And we used lots of assignments that Lynn came up with that it asked students to take roles and write under the guise of a participant in this role. So they could be responding as members of a survey team or investigative reporters, and a whole series of things. We spent a lot of time discussing the actual assignments and the results that we got from the assignments, obviously contributing to Lynn's dissertation. And it was a learning experience for all of us because we got to talk with each other about what constituted successful writing. By the way, that department of basic skills was heavily involved in curricular research. Lynn's program, Minette and Judy's program. I wrote a book myself back then called A Plan for Writing. Harvey Weiner started writing his books while he was at Queensboro. He later moved to LaGuardia and began publishing his textbooks. He published a textbook with Chuck Bazerman called Writing Skills Handbook, and published a whole slew of books. Harvey was one of the most widely published members of the CUNY faculty, I think, in terms of his textbooks. I guess if you had to characterize the pedagogy back then at Queensboro, and probably most of the other CUNY colleges, it was current traditional. But very quickly we became unsatisfied with current traditional. Students weren't catching on. They weren't learning it. They weren't becoming better writers. And so we tried lots and lots of things. So one person wrote a book called Write Me a Ream, in which she used the close method of composition, in which every third or fourth word was left out, and the students had to put in a new word. Bill Herman was having students write from their own personal experience. We did not use much revision, and we did not really think about process until the later 70s. Sandra Pearl is one of the first people to bring process to most people's attention. And her dissertation, which she did at NYU, was on the writing process of 6 students at CUNY. I think it was called 6 Writers Writing. Nancy Summers was doing work in her dissertation on process as well. But that was not something that we thought of at CUNY in the early 70s. We were essentially groping for a solution. We did not know about the people in New Hampshire doing process and doing a lot of personal experience writing until later. When I look back what I did at Rutgers and what I did at CUNY, collaborative learning was always a part of it, though the collaborative learning was a lot less rich than I came to learn about later and use later on. I always had my students at Rutgers look at each other's papers and make some editing changes, and I did that at CUNY as well. So we didn't do any of the really rich rethinking that collaborative learning can help students do now. But I always had students looking at each other's papers, editing, giving comments, giving feedback. And that's something I've always done and I always will do. And I thought that helped the class become much more accustomed to asking for help, getting help, making use of others' insights. So it didn't take long before we realized at CUNY, many of us at CUNY, that there's a larger world out there dealing with many of the same issues that we were facing. And it's a mark of, that we really didn't feel like we're experts, in that we wanted to go and learn from others who were facing some of these issues. So Lynn Troika urged many of us to go to national conferences, and there was money to do that back in 73. So I went to my first 4Cs convention in Cincinnati in 1973 and met lots and lots of people and learned an awful lot about what was going on. I remember meeting Wally Douglas there in 73 and Jix Lloyd Jones. I went in 74 and 75. I was chairing a session at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning when Mina Shaughnessy was talking about a series of film strips that she had devised to teach students edited standard English. And that's when I first got to know Mina pretty well, was at that 8 a.m. session. We had coffee afterwards, and we were talking about lots of issues that we were facing. And she impressed me then, as she kept impressing me for the next years while she lived, with her brains, with her wit, and with her dedication to students. The other way we did things at CUNY was to have the CUNY conferences. So we were sent out to go to national conferences like the 4Cs, and then we had our own CUNY conferences, which were much more in-house. But we did have outside speakers. I remember Walker Gibson was brought down from the University of Massachusetts to talk to us. And we would all get the day off, and we would all travel to Manhattan. I believe one of the CUNY conferences was held at the Commodore Hotel. Another one was held at the Roosevelt House, right near the Hunter College campus. I forget where the third one was. And then we would meet colleagues from all over CUNY who were facing some of the same issues. And we would have workshops devoted to individual problems. So there was a workshop on ESL writing, for instance. There was a workshop on getting students to be more comfortable with individual writing. There were workshops on grading. There were workshops on getting edited standard English. I think it was the combination of the CUNY conferences and the national conferences that made me say, there's really a field here. There's really an awful lot to learn. And made me feel pretty conversant with what was going on. I would be reading the college composition and communication and college English, and started to dedicate myself to this field. And that was impressive. I said, this is something I want to spend my career doing, rather than the literature which I had been trained for, and got my PhD in. I was just finishing my dissertation in 1973 on Dryden's political writings, which didn't have much connection to the kind of prose I was seeing from my students. So there was a bifurcation there. There were two different ways to go. One was to stick with the literature. The other was to immerse myself much more in writing. And I decided to go with the writing. And I'm very glad I did. I think it was 74 or 75 that I joined the CAWS, the CUNY Association of Writing Supervisors. I'm not sure exactly what my title was at Queensboro that would entitle me to become a member of CAWS, but nobody from Queensboro was attending the meetings, and I thought it important to meet other people at CUNY who were involved in some of the same issues I was. We met on Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock in the Graduate Center, which was then at 42nd Street, right opposite the New York Public Library. And I guess we met for 3 hours. It was a really terrific group. We had people who later became extremely famous in the world of composition. Chuck Baserman was there. Dick Larson was there. Don McQuaid was there. That's how I first met Richard Sterling, I believe, there. Ken Bruffy was there. Ken Bruffy had been the head of CAWS. Harvey Weiner was there from LaGuardia Community College. CAWS had two functions in the time I was there. One was to discuss the nuts and bolts of what's going on and how things can become better. Hiring issues, trying to get raises for part-time people, the usual stuff that anybody in a multi-campus situation has to face. But the other side, which I thought was much more interesting, was what I've come to call the invisible university. Because a bunch of us at CAWS decided to set up a reading group and to sit and read some of the major texts in the field. So we would read Moffat's Teaching the Universe of Discourse, for instance, and discuss that for maybe an hour. Kellogg Hunt's book on T-units we read. We read very, very widely. We read Jimmy Britton, his book on development of writing abilities. Many of these were cutting-edge research that was just coming out at the time, and we felt we needed to know about it. I remember in '77, Mina was very, very sick, and her book had just come out. And the question was, well, should we read Miner's book? Are we able to give Miner's book a really careful reading, and can we disagree with it, knowing that she was so sick? And of course, we felt we should read it and go through it and give it a very careful reading, and we did, and it was very, very informative for all of us. Usually one of us would be charged with the task of leading the discussion, but those were very, very powerful discussions. Dick Larson was an extraordinary member of this group, and so was Chuck Bazerman, so was Harvey Weiner. And I learned a lot from that interplay with my colleagues, the interchange with my colleagues. That's the kind of graduate training that I think we all lacked in going into this business, and that's the kind of graduate training I think, the kind of curriculum that I think students ought to get if they're going to be teaching writing. As a result of the reading I did and the conferences I went to, my pedagogy changed a lot. I started having students revise and spent a lot of time with them in conferences about making choices about revision. And it turned out by revising, the students' papers got a lot better. Little wonder. But all those years before that I had taught, I hadn't realized that just giving students one shot at a problem without any expert advice left their papers pretty weak. The second thing I learned, and I learned much of this through Sandra Pearl and Nancy Summers, was notions of writing as a process. That there's a kind of incubation period, a thinking period, a writing period, an editing period, a proofreading period, and many of those can be recursive. So you can write a draft, edit it, then read it over, make changes, and then edit it again. It could be an endless loop, but of course with time, things did have an ending. But the student writing got much better when I started to understand the writing process as well and incorporate elements of that into my teaching. Growing directly out of CAWS was the fact that Sandra, Richard, and I, Richard Sterling, Sandra Pearl, and I, were interested in finding out how students could become better writers. What changed as they became better writers? Did their rhetoric change? Was it just their surface features? And Minor Shaughnessy encouraged us to apply for a grant to find out some answers. So we did. We applied for a grant from FIPSE and Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. We sent it in, and we got funded. I think we got funded for $75,000, which was an impressive amount of money back then. This is in '77. So Sandra, Richard, and I started working on a rather large longitudinal study of students over the first year of college in their writing, and trying to collect writing from students at lots of different CUNY campuses. This was, by the way, right after the city declared bankruptcy. And Ford to City dropped dead. Everybody remembers that headline. And things were very, very tough. People were laid off. I think 1,200 full-time faculty were laid off at CUNY. Richard, Sandra, and I, fortunately, were not. But we were all concerned about losing our jobs. Anyway, our study was enlarged by the fact that we received another grant, a very small grant, $15,000 from the Bay Area Writing Project, to set up the New York City Writing Project. And we were going to base that at Lehman College. I believe we spent more time on the New York City Writing Project than we did on the FIPSE grant, though we really learned a lot with the FIPSE grant as well. We found out lots and lots of stuff about how the students were improving as writers. And it turned out that one real marker of the student's success in writing was the ability to write more, fluency. And if a student was successful at writing, it usually showed up in his or her fluency. The surface features were still problems with them, but the students got into their topics, got into their subjects, and with growing confidence could write more, say more about a particular issue. And they realized that that's what the teachers wanted, and so they provided that. It turned out that the tail wound up wagging the dog because we spent lots and lots of time on the New York City writing project. Richard Sterling was in charge of that. And Sandra and I taught in the summer of 77, summer 77, summer 78, I'm not sure which, I think it was summer of 78, that project, and it was a real eye-opener for us. None of us had ever taught high school before, and here we had these incredible high school teachers who were facing many of the exact same problems that we were facing in the colleges, in the community colleges and the four-year colleges, particularly in the SEEK program, with very little help, very little curricular help from the Board of Education, and very little theoretical underpinnings. And so we had them do lots and lots of reading with Jimmy Moffett, Jimmy Brereton, and we had them read Miner's book. And they benefited tremendously. They didn't like theory too much, but they saw that a lot of this stuff was really very, very helpful to them in their actual teaching. One year, Mina came to Richard, Sandra, and myself and asked us if we'd be willing to work on a committee to devise a CUNY-wide assessment test. We knew that this was not Mina's idea. It was thrust on her by the Central Board of Higher Education, and Mina was charged with implementing it. We also knew that if we didn't come up with a test, someone else would, because clearly somebody at the Board of Higher Education wanted that test. So Mina, as the Dean of Instructional Resources, set to work to do that and asked Sandra, Richard, and myself. And so we did what we could. Right away, Richard, Sandra, and I were quite unhappy with the idea that it would be a one-shot test, that would be a high-stakes test, and it was a pass-fail situation. We were coming to read the work of Ed White, who was saying back then, this is in the 70s, that you really need 2 occasions of writing, or you need a revision opportunities to really test whether a student could master writing. And clearly the CUNY test was not going to allow for that. It was going to be a high-stakes, single-shot test. And Richard and Sandra and I tried to work out a way to get a chance for revision, or a way to have 2 tests rather than a single one. Again, we were thinking about those students who were going to be washed out of the city university. And clearly that's what the purpose of this test was going to be, to get rid of the students who were not succeeding at writing. And we were very unhappy about the criteria that was sort of given to us by Mina. And we didn't have any choice about how this was going to be scored or how it was going to be implemented. We were just told it's going to be a one-shot test. In 77 and 78, and until 79, June 79, I was on leave from Queensboro, paid for by the FIPSI grant, and was teaching at Lehman College. And my grant was coming to an end, and I needed to think about what I was going to do. Was I going to head back to Queensboro? And I found a job opening came up to run the writing program at Wayne State University in Detroit. And I said, I'll apply for that. I was at the MLA convention, and I'd just given a paper with Don Hirsch, E.D. Hirsch, in which we disagreed with each other about grading criteria. I had known Hirsch from a conference that we pulled together through the FIPSI grant at Lehman College. And I was not impressed by Don Hirsch's approaches to grading and his approaches to thinking about composition and fluency, et cetera, et cetera. The people at Wayne State seemed to be impressed that I was on the same panel with Don Hirsch, and we got into a disagreement with each other. They were intrigued that I could get some of my students to become better writers. And they admitted that they were faced with some of the same issues that we faced at CUNY and just didn't have the staff to do it. And I made it clear that I was their guy if they wanted to improve the quality of student writing. They were also interested in setting up a PhD program in writing. And I told them I would love to help them do that because I had just come from CAWS and the work I was doing on reading all these curriculum materials and reading the latest research in writing program administration and in writing. And I knew lots and lots of the books that they should include in their PhD program. And they hired me at an enormous raise. My wife had just had a baby, and we had a one-bedroom apartment in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and we were going to have to move anyway. So I said, all right, I'll move to Detroit. Realizing, I think at the time, that that was my goodbye to New York. In my years at CUNY, I came to feel that I was part of a really big experiment. For the first time in American history, the doors of a major American higher education institution were open to everybody. And we were trying to teach the people who walked in those doors. We were not always successful, and we were always condemned by many of our fellow faculty members. Some of the language that fellow faculty members at Queensboro and certainly at City College used was just atrocious, was quite offensive. And the faculty members, particularly in English, did not like that. They wanted students who represented what they themselves were like when they were in college, rather than this new breed of students coming from all over the world, filling the classrooms and not being able to write as well as these folks wanted them to. I wanted these students to become literate, just as I had become literate, and just as millions of Americans had become literate. I didn't realize I was part of a huge experiment at the time, but now I realize I was. Can you make students who don't have the right kinds of skills, skilled at language, in touch with their own feelings, being able to participate in the world of affairs successfully? And I felt that I could bring them a good ways along the way, and I think I did. They got to read critically, to write carefully and successfully, to convince people of their ideas, to take their ideas seriously, to take the world of ideas seriously, to introduce them to the intellectual life. And I've always thought that that's one of the most important things a college professor does, is let students into this world of ideas that matter and allowing them to have their own say about ideas.